The pre-assessment dossier on humanity ran to 640 pages, which was longer than the pre-assessment for any of the 12 species Sael Vel-Antha-Keth had evaluated in 211 years of diplomatic service, and which she had read on the transit with the focused attention of someone for whom thoroughness was not a virtue, but a practice so embedded it was no longer distinguishable from the person doing it. The dossier was thorough. It was also, she noted on the third reading, organized in the specific way of documents compiled by people who had a conclusion, and had gathered the evidence that supported the conclusion, and had been thorough in their gathering of that evidence, without having been equally thorough in their consideration of evidence that might not support it. This was not unusual. Pre-assessment dossiers for mandate evaluations were compiled by the Stability Council's Analytical Division, which had a mission and compiled documentation in service of the mission, which was what analytical divisions did. She had worked with pre-assessments for 211 years. She knew how to read them and what they were not. She made a note in her personal log. Pre-assessment organization suggests confirmation bias in collection methodology. Weight source documentation accordingly. Supplement with primary access. She was going to see everything herself. This was standard practice for mandate evaluations. She noted it because noting it was thorough and thoroughness was the practice. The liaison's assignment file was appended to the operational section of the dossier. She read it with the same attention she had read everything else. Cam Rourke, 41 years, colony administrator on 3 successive postings, no diplomatic training, no interspecies relations certification, no formal protocol education. The assignment note from the Diplomatic Coordination Office said, selected for directness over polish, as the evaluation's integrity requires unmediated access to human behavior rather than diplomatic representation of it. She read the note twice. It was, she found, a more honest acknowledgement of the evaluation's requirements than she had typically received from facilitation offices, which tended to emphasize what the assigned liaison would do for the ambassador rather than what the evaluation actually needed. She noted, assignment selection rationale indicates Confederacy Diplomatic Office has thought carefully about this evaluation's specific requirements. The assigned individual will not attempt to manage her impressions. This is either an advantage or a more sophisticated form of management than the standard version. Assess on arrival. The station was built in the way of humanity's diplomatic architecture. The careful, derivative synthesis of a species that had read what other species built for their significant spaces, and had made choices about what to take and what to leave, the choices producing something that was not any of its sources and was, in the specific way of syntheses that had worked, its own thing. She noted this. She noted it as data rather than assessment, because assessment required context she did not yet have. He was at the docking port. He was not in diplomatic dress, which the protocol guidance she had been given indicated was the standard reception attire. He was in what she would later understand was his ordinary working clothes, the practical dress of someone who had spent 11 years managing the material operations of colony settlements and had developed a relationship with clothing that was organized around function rather than signal. He was tall in the way of some humans, and he had the specific, present quality of someone who was paying attention to what was in front of them rather than to how they appeared to what was in front of them. He extended his hand. She took it. The grip was brief and direct, and had the quality of a convention practiced to the level of automaticity. He was not thinking about the handshake, which meant the handshake was simply what he did, and was therefore information about him rather than performance for her. She noted this. Ambassador Vel-Antha-Keth, he said. He had done the pronunciation work. The name came out in the specific way of someone who had practiced it rather than approximate it. I'm Cam Rourke. I've been told to show you everything. He looked at her with the direct quality she had noted in his file as the characteristic the assignment was built on. I plan to do exactly that. She looked at him. "I have reviewed your assignment file," she said. "I figured you had," he said. "It's accurate." "The note about directness over polish," she said. "Also accurate," he said. She looked at the station. She looked at him. She made the note in her evaluation log that would be the first entry. Liaison appears to mean what he said. Assessment ongoing. The colony expansion data was in the Confederacy's standardized format, which meant it was the data the Confederacy had gathered using the Confederacy's methods organized into the Confederacy's categories. She had the full archive. She had been reviewing it for 6 weeks before arriving on the station, which was why the dossier ran to 640 pages. He sat with her in the data review room on the station's 4th day, and she pulled up the expansion velocity charts, which were the first item in the dossier's evidence compilation, and she said, "The velocity pattern." "Yeah," he said, "it's high. Higher than any species in the Confederacy's current membership at comparable developmental stage," she said. "That's in the dossier," he said. "Yes," she said. "I'm reviewing the source data." "What do you want to know about the source data?" he said, with the practical quality of someone who was going to help her get what she came for. "The expansion events," she said. "The decision-making behind each one. The dossier documents the expansion, but not the reasoning." He looked at the charts. He said, "Pull up colony establishment record CE 4471, Verath Secondary." She pulled it up. "Read the resource pressure section," he said. She read it. It documented the resource constraints on the originating colony, the specific, practical pressure of a population that had exceeded the sustainable extraction capacity of its current location and had 2 options: reduce population or find more space. She read the demographics. She read the timeline. She read the decision record, which was in the plain language of a colonial council making a practical determination. "They were going to run out," she said. "In 11 years at the documented trajectory," he said. "The expansion was the resolution that preserved both the population and the originating colony's viability. The alternative was managed contraction, which had been attempted at 3 other colonies with significant humanitarian consequences." "That information is not in the dossier," she said. "No," he said. "The dossier documents the expansion events. The context for each expansion is in the colonial administrative records." She looked at him. "You knew the dossier didn't contain this." "I know what's in the colonial administrative records," he said. "I've been an administrator for 11 years. You could have submitted the administrative records to the Stability Council's dossier compilation process," she said. "The Stability Council didn't ask for them," he said. "The Council asked for expansion data. They got expansion data. I wasn't on the compilation team." She looked at the resource pressure documentation. She looked at the expansion velocity chart. "You're going to want to pull the administrative records for each expansion event," he said, "if you want the context." "Yes," she said, "I am. I have access," he said. "I'll set up a secondary archive for the evaluation." "How long will it take?" she said. "To compile the records," he said. 3 days. To review them, that depends on how you read." "I read thoroughly," she said. "I figured," he said. The mediation session was for a water rights dispute between 2 colony settlements whose extraction territories had developed an overlap as both settlements expanded. She sat in the observer section with the evaluation log and watched. The human mediator was not a trained diplomat. She was a retired engineer who had designed water extraction systems for 20 years and understood the technical parameters of the dispute at the level of the people having the dispute, which was the level that mattered for resolution. She did not manage the room's affect. She did not perform neutrality. She asked questions with the direct quality of someone who wanted accurate answers rather than managed ones. The representatives from both settlements were angry. They were angry in the visible, unmanaged way of humans who were not performing their emotions for an evaluating audience, because they did not know there was an evaluating audience, which was the condition under which the session had been arranged at her request. They said things that were not diplomatic. They also said things that were very precise about what they actually needed, because the anger had removed the management, and what was underneath the management was the specific, clear articulation of people who needed something and were saying what it was. The session produced a resolution in 4 hours. She wrote in the evaluation log, "Human conflict expression functions as information transmission rather than as aggressive display. Anger appears to reduce rather than increase ambiguity about actual needs. Resolution timeline faster than Confederacy equivalent mediation for comparable disputes, average 11. 3 days. Requires further documentation." She showed Cam the entry after the session. This was not standard evaluation practice. She showed it because it was the accurate record of what she had observed, and she had found, across the first 3 weeks, that showing him the accurate record produced more useful data than managing what she revealed. He read it, he said, "The anger thing, yeah. Your species expresses emotions in the mediation context," she said. "The Confederacy's mediation frameworks are built on emotional regulation as a prerequisite for productive dialogue." "How does that work?" he said. "It reduces the volatility that might otherwise disrupt the process," she said. "Does it help people say what they actually need?" he said. She considered this. "The frameworks are designed to produce resolution," she said. "In how many days on average?" he said. 11.3 for comparable disputes," she said. He looked at the resolution record from the 4-hour session. He did not say anything. He did not need to. She wrote a second note in the evaluation log. "The efficiency advantage may be structural rather than incidental. Requires examination of whether emotional regulation prerequisite in Confederacy mediation serves the process or the appearance of the process." Note, this line of inquiry was not in the evaluation scope, documenting as emergent finding. She requested the Earth biosphere documentation on day 47. He retrieved it without asking why, because not asking why was his operational mode, and because she had found, across 47 days, that his not asking why was not the incuriosity of someone who didn't want to know but the specific, considered courtesy of someone who understood that the evaluation required her to reach her own conclusions, and that asking why was a way of inserting himself into the conclusion-reaching process, which was not his function. She read the biosphere documentation the way she read everything. The Confederacy's xenoecological database had an Earth entry that was 43 pages long, which was longer than most entries and shorter than the entry deserved, which she understood after the first 12 pages. The standard xenoecological categories documented the expected hostility parameters: temperature variance, atmospheric composition, predation density, resource competition indices. Earth's numbers were high in all of these categories, in the high end of the death world spectrum. The anomalous entries began on page 19. The xenoecological team that had compiled the Earth entry had done their work correctly, and had encountered data that didn't fit the standard categories, and had documented it honestly under the heading non-standard hostility mechanisms rather than forcing it into categories that would have made the data fit. She read through the non-standard section with the growing attention of someone who was reading towards something and could sense it before it arrived. The standard death world hostility mechanisms were consistent across the 4 previously evaluated death world origin species: resource competition, predation, environmental extremity, pathogenic density. These mechanisms produced a specific, documented adaptive response profile: aggressive territorial behavior, high reproductive urgency, strong in-group-out-group differentiation, reduced long-term planning capacity in favor of immediate threat response. Earth had all of these, and had the additional non-standard mechanisms: geological instability, electromagnetic anomalies producing navigation challenges, weather pattern volatility exceeding the standard modeling parameters by a factor the entry noted as outside current theoretical framework, And she read this entry 3 times. A planetary biosphere characterized by the specific, unusual quality of apparent systemic optimization for the elimination of multicellular life, which was the xenoecological team's precise language for something that had no standard category, because the standard categories had been built for planets that were hostile in the ways. Planets were usually hostile, and Earth appeared to be hostile in a way that was not the way planets were usually hostile. She put down the documentation and looked at the window, which showed Varath Station's freight corridor doing its freight business in the specific, indifferent way of working infrastructure. She thought about the 4 previously evaluated Deathworld species. She thought about the adaptive response profile that the standard hostility mechanisms produced. She thought about the profile she had been documenting in her evaluation log across 47 days, which was aggressive territorial behavior, yes, but coupled with protective instinct for outgroup members in ways the standard profile did not predict. High reproductive urgency, yes, but also long-term planning capacity that the standard profile said should be reduced. Strong in-group-out-group differentiation, yes, but in-group boundaries that expanded under conditions of shared threat to include previously outgroup members. She thought about the non-standard hostility mechanisms. She thought about what it would produce in a species if your planet was not just trying to kill you in the expected ways, but in ways that the xenoecological models did not have categories for. What you would have to become to survive something that did not fit the standard threat models. She went to find Cam. He was in the administrative office he had been using for the evaluation's document management. The room had become, across 47 days, the working center of the evaluation, its walls showing the archive structure and the documentation threads and the secondary database of colonial administrative records he had compiled. He looked up when she came in. The biosphere documentation, she said. Yes, he said. The non-standard hostility section, she said. Yeah, he said. You knew it was there, she said. I grew up on a colony world, he said. Earth briefing is part of the colonial curriculum. The non-standard section it's something people know about. The framework the Council used to develop the mandate criteria was built on 4 previous Deathworld species, she said. I know, he said. The adaptive response profile those species displayed was driven by the standard hostility mechanisms, she said. The profile is documented and the criteria were derived from the profile. Yes, he said. Your planet's non-standard hostility mechanisms would produce a different adaptive response, she said. The criteria were not developed for the profile your planet would produce. He looked at her. That seems like a significant finding, he said, in the specific register of someone who had understood this for 11 years and was hearing someone else arrive at it and was giving the arrival its due weight. It is, she said. It is also not a finding I can file with the Stability Council without extensive documentation. How long does the documentation take? He said. She looked at the mandate's activation timestamp in her credentials archive. The activation window was in 23 days. Longer than 23 days, she said. He looked at the activation timestamp. He looked at the documentation wall. He looked at her. Then we have a problem, he said. Yes, she said. I have been having this problem for approximately 3 weeks and have been documenting it and have not yet found the resolution. What does the resolution require? He said. She said in the plain register. It requires me to determine whether my growing conviction that the framework is wrong is a genuine analytical finding or a response to 3 months of proximity to the subject of the evaluation. He was quiet. Both would produce the same conclusion, she said. Only one is valid. How do you tell the difference? He said. Documentation, she said. The honest kind, the kind that doesn't start with the conclusion. You've been doing that, he said. Yes, she said. For 3 weeks, he said. The process is ongoing, she said. He looked at the documentation wall, the archive structure, the colonial records, the evaluation log entries, the biosphere data, the mediation session notes, the contradiction catalog she had been building since day 12, when the data had stopped resolving into the clean outputs the framework predicted. He had seen her build it. He had provided documentation and had sat in sessions and had answered questions, and had not answered the questions she had asked him not to answer and had not told her what conclusions to draw, and she had drawn them herself, in the specific, unglamorous way of honest analytical work, one entry at a time. "I'm going to invoke the review pending protocol," she said. "It extends the activation window by 60 days while I document the analytical complexity." "Will the council accept the invocation?" he said. "They have to," she said. "It's in the mandate framework. An evaluating ambassador can invoke it once per evaluation for documented analytical complexity." She paused. "I have 400 pages of documented analytical complexity." "You said you've been documenting for 3 weeks," he said. "I write quickly when the subject warrants it," she said. He looked at her. 400 pages in 3 weeks. "3 weeks of intensive documentation," she said. The biosphere data accelerated the pace, and the mediation session findings, and the colonial administrative records context for the expansion events, and the innovation plateau correlation analysis. "The innovation plateau," he said. 17 key development categories in which the Confederacy has shown no meaningful advancement in the past 60 years, she said. "I ran the correlation against the termination and isolation records for the 3 previous cases. The correlation is," she paused. "It requires further documentation before I can characterize it responsibly." He looked at her. "You've been working on this for 3 weeks," he said. "Yes," she said. "By yourself," he said. "In the evenings." "The analytical work is my function," she said. "You could have told me," he said. "It required independent development," she said. "The conclusion has to be mine. If I develop it in conversation with you, the council will say the proximity influenced the analysis." He was quiet for a moment. "Does it matter what the council says if the analysis is right?" "It matters to whether the council acts on the analysis," she said, "which matters to the mandate's final status." He looked at the activation timestamp. He looked at her. "What happens to you," he said, "if you file the assessment and the council doesn't act on it?" She looked at the mandate in her credentials archive. "The mandate remains in my authority," she said, "which means it remains my decision." "And if the council says you were compromised by proximity," he said, "then they appoint a new evaluator," she said, "with a new evaluation period." "And the mandate," he said, "remains active until the new evaluation concludes," she said. He sat with this. "So the question is whether you file the assessment and trust the council to examine their own framework," he said, "or whether you don't file it and activate the mandate yourself, because you're not certain your conclusion is sound." "Yes," she said, "that is the question." "What's your answer?" he said. She looked at him. She looked at 400 pages of documentation. She looked at the evaluation log, which had been the honest record of her process across 50 days and which was, she believed, the record of a genuine analytical finding rather than a conclusion produced by proximity. She believed this. She was also aware that believing it and being able to demonstrate it were not the same thing, and that the demonstration required exactly the kind of documentation she had been building for 3 weeks, and that 3 more weeks would make more thorough and 6 weeks more thorough still. "I'm going to invoke the protocol," she said, "and document for the full 60 days, and then file what the documentation supports. And if the documentation supports the finding," he said, "then I file the finding," she said. "And if the council says you were compromised," he said, "then I submit to the review process," she said, "and the review process will have the documentation, 400 pages plus 60 more days of it." He looked at her. "You're very thorough," he said. "Yes," she said, I am. She worked at the end-of-day sessions for 60 more days, and the documentation grew past 400 pages and past 500 and arrived at 612 the night before she filed it, which she noted was longer than the pre-assessment dossier, and was, in its organization, the specific opposite of the dossier, built from evidence toward conclusion rather than from conclusion toward evidence. She let him read it before she filed. He read all of it. He read it over 2 days, which was faster than she expected, and then he came to the end-of-day session on the second day and sat across from her at the table and put the document down. The innovation plateau correlation, he said. Yes, she said. You're saying the Confederacy stopped generating certain kinds of development after the Death World isolations, he said. I'm saying the correlation exists and is statistically significant and requires explanation, she said. I am not saying causation in the filing. I'm saying the correlation is documented and the examination of causation is warranted. The council is going to push back on that section, he said. I know, she said, because it implies the council's previous isolation decisions may have had negative consequences for galactic development, he said. Yes, she said. Which is uncomfortable, he said. Yes, she said. Is the correlation sound, he said. The methodology is in the appendix, she said. 47 pages. The data is from the Confederacy's own development records. He looked at the document. He looked at the appendix notation. He said, with the specific, particular quality of someone who had been doing this for 4.5 months and had arrived at the end of it, you read the appendix. I always read the appendix, she said. I know, he said. I've noticed. She looked at him. The pre-assessment dossier was 640 pages, she said. I read it 3 times on the transit. On the third reading, I noted the confirmation bias in the collection methodology. In the dossier about my species, he said. Yes, she said. That's when you decided to pull the source documentation, he said. That's when I noted the source documentation should be pulled, she said. I make notes about what the thorough approach requires, and then I do the thorough approach. He looked at the filing document. He looked at the timestamp on it, which was tomorrow morning's diplomatic transmission window. He looked at her. This is going to create problems for you, he said, with the council. Yes, she said. They're going to say the conclusion is a product of proximity, he said. They are going to say that, she said. I have documentation that addresses the argument. The documentation being thorough, he said. The documentation being accurate, she said. Thorough is the method, accurate is the standard. He was quiet for a moment. In 211 years, he said, is this the most complicated evaluation you've done? She looked at the 612-page document. She looked at the evaluation log, which ran longer than the document. She looked at the documentation wall, which had been growing for 4.5 months, and which was the honest record of the most significant analytical problem she had encountered in 211 years of diplomatic service. It is the first evaluation that required me to examine whether the framework was wrong rather than whether the subject was, she said. In 211 years. Does that answer the question? He said. Yes, she said. He looked at the table. He looked at the end-of-day session, which had become the structure of the evaluation, and which had been the structure of 4.5 months, and which was, she had been aware for some weeks, something she was going to be aware of the absence of when the evaluation's conclusion changed its form. She had been documenting this awareness in the personal log, not the evaluation log, because the personal log was hers, and the awareness was hers, and the distinction between the evaluation's integrity and her own interior accounting was a distinction she had maintained carefully. He said, "What happens to the extended evaluation after you file?" "The council reviews the filing," she said. "They act or they don't act. While the review is pending, the evaluation continues." "You remain the evaluating ambassador," he said. "Yes," she said. "Which means you remain here," he said. "The evaluation requires on-site presence," she said. "And the liaison," he said. The evaluation's integrity requires unmediated access to human behavior rather than diplomatic representation of it, she said. That was the rationale for your assignment. It's still the rationale, he said. Yes, she said. He looked at her. She looked at him. The end-of-day session was in the specific, unhurried quality it had taken on across 4.5 months. The specific quality of two people who had been doing significant work together for a long time and had arrived in the work at the specific, indelible familiarity of people who had seen each other think. I'm going to file it tomorrow, she said, in the morning transmission window. I know, he said. The council will take time to respond, she said. Significant time given the implications. How much time, he said. The documentation is 612 pages, she said. The appendix is 47. So they'll read the summary, he said. The summary is 40 pages, she said. Some of them will read the summary, he said. Yes, she said. And then it will go to the analytical division, and the analytical division will read the full document and the appendix and produce a review assessment, which will take approximately 6 months. 6 months, he said. The review period is in the mandate framework, she said. The council has 6 months to respond to a filed supplementary assessment. He looked at the table, and during those 6 months, he said, the evaluation continues, she said. On-site presence, liaison assignment, end-of-day sessions. He looked at her. I've been showing you everything for 4.5 months, he said. Yes, she said. There's more, he said. There usually is, she said. He was quiet for a moment in the way of someone who was at the end of something and was in the specific, particular quality of the end, and was also, because ends produce the next thing at the beginning of it. The colony on Keth 7, he said. They've been running an adaptation program for 3 years that isn't in the Confederacy's documentation. It's relevant to the Innovation Plateau section. I didn't mention it earlier because the documentation for it is in the administrative records, and I wanted you to get there from the biosphere analysis rather than from me pointing at it. She looked at him. You've been managing the sequence of what you show me, she said. I've been showing you everything, he said, in the order that let you develop the conclusions yourself. She looked at the 612-page document. The Keth 7 program, she said. I'll get you the administrative records tomorrow, he said, after the filing. After the filing, she said. She looked at the table. She looked at the session, which was doing what it had been doing for 4.5 months. She looked at him. The something, she said. He looked at her. Between our worlds, she said. I came with authority to end everything between our worlds. That is what the mandate authorizes. I know, he said. I am filing tomorrow a document that recommends the mandate not be activated, she said. That is the conclusion the 612 pages support. Yes, he said. But you understand that the document's conclusion, she said, is that the something between our worlds should not end. It is not a document about what the something should become. No, he said, it isn't. She looked at him, he looked at her. I find that question, she said, significantly harder to document. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, with the directness he brought to everything, in my experience, the hardest things to document are the ones worth documenting. She looked at the table. She looked at the evening, which was the evening it was and which was also, in the specific quality of 4.5 months of evenings that had become what they had become, something she had not had a category for when she arrived at the station with a 640-page dossier and a mandate in her credentials archive, and the clinical detachment of 211 years of diplomatic service. She said, I am going to need a new section in the documentation. He said, I'll be here. She said, the section will require primary source access. He said, that's what I'm for. She looked at him, the non-diplomatic version,